I appreciate everybody checking in, and as you quite well say, you know, I think that so often, Chris, people that we cover over the awareness and the hard truths of what's really going on. And I think that very often we all think we have a solution, but very often we are not including the right people in those conversations. And so, you know, rather than start with what I see or what I interpret as the word conservation, I think we should talk about the elephant in the room, so to speak. And let's talk about what is reality. What are the uncomfortable truths? Every single one of us on this talk that works in a conservation field has got some uncomfortable truths that we kind of brush under the carpet a lot of the time. They truths that we don't really want to talk about. We kind of shy away from. But I think that in a world of almost 8 billion people, the very first truth that we have to embrace is that we're humans, and therefore we consume. We have a wider variety of diet than any other mammal on the planet. There's nothing that comes close to the volume that we consume. We utilize every patch of ground that we possibly can to grow the food that 8 billion mouths need to feed on. And we modify our habitat to such a degree that it pushes out absolutely every other naturally occurring form of life and modifies the biodiversity of an area to such a degree that while this photo shows you where a human lives or where millions of humans live, we can all agree that this is not even a remote, there's not 1% of this photo that represents what it once was. I think one of the most shocking things that I've kind of realized and looked at is that 96% of all mammals on Earth are humans and our livestock. So everything else is just 4%. From elephants to bats, from pangolins to rhinos, that's just 4%. And we've managed to populate the Earth with our pets and our livestock and ourselves to the degree that we are 96% of all mammals on Earth. And I think that's a very sobering thought. And so there's a lot of conversations going around where we do these things to make ourselves feel good. We talk constantly about clean energy. Well, the fact behind a wind farm is the fact that it took tons and tons and tons of coal to generate the steel to build the windmill in the first place. So while on the face of it, we may like the idea of the clean energy generated by a windmill, very seldom the uncomfortable truth is the fact that it took 140 tons of steel to build a windmill. That's serious impact. There's a mine somewhere that's got to supply that steel. There's a mine somewhere that's got to supply the coal to melt that steel down. And yes, absolutely, the energy that may be created by that windmill may be pretty clean energy. But how we got to the point of generating that energy is everything but clean. I hear a comment a lot that I'm a vegetarian because it's kinder to wildlife. Well, I'm not sure how much wildlife occurs in what I call a wildlife holocaust. You look at a bean field where there's not a single naturally occurring organism allowed to grow. Not a weed, not a grasshopper, not a bug, not a beetle, not a plant, not an animal is allowed to grow there. And yet we try and pretend that by eating vegetarian, we have less impact. And so I think that what I want to talk about a little bit today is these realities. The reality that the wildlife has so little space on this planet and the ecosystems are under such enormous pressure, but we all think it's them that are providing the pressure. Whoever to each of us individually, them is represented by. It's never us that are the pressure, but remember, every single one of us on this talk, every single person that you know has impact by virtue of the fact that we want to switch on a light, we use energy. Energy is generated by coal, by mining, by a number of different things. And so I think that one of the most uncomfortable truths is the fact that as humans, as society, we have this massive ability to modify our planet. I like to always throw in there, you know, what people think is the largest man-made thing on earth. I'll ask that question often in a presentation to schools or whatever, and kids will put up their hands and they'll go the Eiffel Tower or the Great Wall of China or, you know, whatever it might be. The sobering reality is that the largest man-made thing on earth is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch that's twice the size of Texas. A ball of plastic floating in the ocean twice the size of Texas. Nobody wants to talk about it for fear that somebody might identify them as the owner of it. America doesn't want to talk about it because they might be tasked with cleaning it up. Japan doesn't want to talk about it because they might be tasked with cleaning it up. So it's better to just ignore it. And how can we ignore, and how come it's not common knowledge that the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is the largest man-made thing on earth? You know, I don't like to harp on the negatives, but I do think that all of these facts just give us a really good sense of reality. So now that we've established reality and we've head on talked about some uncomfortable truths, let's talk about what I translate as the true meaning of conservation. So to a lot of us, conservation might mean the anti-poaching teams that remove hundreds of gin traps or snares or catch poachers. Absolutely, that is conservation. We might be talking about large translocations of key species into new ecosystems or freshly recovered ecosystems. Absolutely, that's conservation. We might talk about initiatives in different parts of Africa to remove wire snares from the feet of giraffe. By the way, Giraffe Conservation Foundation removes hundreds of such snares in Murchison Falls National Park. That is absolutely conservation. Teaching the youth, getting out into the field, making sure that they possibly get exposed to some conservation ideas and thoughts and some conservation ideals, making sure that we expose them to it. Yet none of that completely sums up this amazing word that we use so easily called conservation. In my mind, there's only one true explanation for the word conservation, and that is the conserving of the entire biodiversity. What is the point of saving a giraffe if we don't save the habitat to maintain that giraffe healthy? That habitat has got to have every player in it. That particular image is quite interesting because it's a riverine in Mozambique, and the moth is a frog-footed moth that was thought to be extinct, and the last sample was collected by Professor Alan Gardner in the 70s, and nobody had found a sample since then. He told me if the rainfall gets to this stage and if the conditions are just like this, I'd love to come and see if we can find some. Well, he found 13 of them in one night. What does that mean to an elephant? We don't know. But what we do know is it's a really important component of a healthy ecosystem. And so based on the fact that so many of you in this group are scientists and people who understand really the depth of conservation, I'll use a word that I'm sure you're very familiar with, which is plasticity. In other words, flexibility. So something like this moth has got almost zero behavioral plasticity. He needs a very specific plant, very specific conditions, probably very specific location, otherwise he ceases to exist. An animal like an elephant has got a very wide plasticity. He can eat almost anything. He can live in many, many different ecosystems. And so there's lots of places on the planet where the elephant can live. And seeing a healthy elephant population does not by any means mean that you've got healthy conservation. Seeing a healthy and diverse insect population where they've got almost zero plasticity absolutely speaks to a healthy ecosystem. And so let's talk a little bit about modern day conservation. It's a very different conversation to what we were having 30 years ago and when I first got into the guiding and the hunting industry. And, you know, I can remember as a young kid in the early 90s, you know, being on a tracking team as we dehorned rhinos in Matusadonna. And, you know, I can remember game drives in Mana Pools where we saw half a dozen rhino in one afternoon drive. Those days have gone. And one of my most motivating things in my life is the fact that those days have gone. In one lifetime, we've seen this amazing change. But we've also seen some really dedicated people dedicating their lives to changing the way we do conservation. And I really believe that conservation is in this order. We've got to include the community in our solutions. We've got to base everything we do on a foundation of science and facts, not emotion and ideas. And most importantly, we must continue the frontline protection and traditional conservation that we truly know. So let's go through these things for a minute, and let's start with conservation. Does the community benefit from the ecosystem? Does the community benefit from your conservation ideals? Are you looking at the community as a participant, or are you looking at them just as a threat? Do you understand the needs of the community? Have you spent enough time sitting under the mango tree to understand their needs? We have a chimpanzee sanctuary that we support in Congo, and a fairly large NGO donated a bunch of money to the local pygmy groups there and came in with a bunch of experts to teach them how to raise guinea pigs, in the hopes that the guinea pigs could replace some of the protein that they were getting from the bushmeat harvesting that they were doing in the forest in Kahuzi-Biega National Park. Well, I got to the area one day, and the tribal leaders came and said, we want to have a meeting. And for those of you that live in areas like this, when they come for a meeting, it's either really, really good or really, really bad. And there's very little in between. This was an interesting meeting because they said, look, we've done everything these people told us to do. We've bred the guinea pigs. We've got hundreds of them. What must we do with them now? I said, no, you're supposed to eat them. What? But only dirty people would eat these. No one had ever asked them if they taught them how to farm guinea pigs, would they actually eat them? No one had asked them that question. And so that time spent under the mango tree, that time spent with communities, that time spent understanding their wants and their needs, understanding their perspective, gives us the ability as African conservationists to do African conservation. Because there's not a single sustainable, and I use that word very carefully here, not a single sustainable initiative that is generated around a first world table without inclusion of local customs and local tribes and perspective. And if you don't include community beneficiation and their perspective in your solution, it may last while you're there. But one of our vets in the Congo actually said something to me that stopped me dead in my tracks. He's a Spanish guy and he's half crazy, and he's our chimpanzee vet. And I think you've got to be half crazy to live in the middle of DRC and look after chimpanzees and do anesthesias all day and all of that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, he said, Ivan, we have to teach the Congolese how to look after their own wildlife. I have to teach these vets because one day I'll be gone and you'll be gone too. And all of the expats will be gone and all the NGOs will be gone. And if we haven't done a good enough job of teaching the Congolese how to do their Congolese conservation, then when we leave, the wildlife will be destroyed. And I think that is such a poignant fact. And I think that very often we are very arrogant in our outlook and we don't include the communities as much as we would like. Do the communities understand the value of their wildlife? And do we, the conservationists, understand the value of their perspective? So what do you see here? To me, it's the king of beasts. And to many of you in this room, it's the king of beasts. To this guy, it's a rite of passage. If he kills that lion, he's going to turn into a man. To this guy, it's the greatest threat on earth to his livelihood. His entire livelihood hinges on the health of his herd of cattle. A lion that eats his cattle is the demon. So for that guy, his perspective is very, very different. To the company that owns this vehicle, the lion represents one of the keystone species that people will pay a lot of money to come and see. A world without lions is definitely a world with less tourists. And so really what I'm telling you here, and there's many, many other slides I could have included here, is that if we want to see the lions return to their former home range, if we want to see conservation working, it takes a team effort. So this is a photo that I think captures this quite nicely. We did a lion translocation a few years ago to Kutada 11 in Mozambique. We translocated 24 lions. We'll talk about that in a little while. Today, there's 62 individuals there. But what I like about this photo is the top hands are the hands of the local chief. There's hands of a scientist in there. There's hands of a veterinary surgeon. There's hands of a pilot, and there's hands of one of the guides from the area. And that lion's paw could not be supported figuratively or physically without everybody's hands in that picture. You can't support that lion just with one set of hands. It's not possible. You don't have the knowledge base to do it. So let's get on to our second thing. Why is science so important? Very, very simple. Like any business in the world, what you measure matters. And it's really been quite fun diving into this question. Why does it matter where this quail lives? This is a blue quail from Texas, by the way. Why does it matter where it lives, where it walks, what it does? I tell you why it matters. Because the more we know about this quail, the better job we can do to create a balanced ecosystem so that the quail can thrive. On the completely other end of the scale, elephant collaring. This was an elephant that we collared in Mozambique to try and see where they moved and how they moved and when they moved. And what we realized is that contrary to popular belief and actually a fair amount of other research, the elephants were just staying in the swamp, in the Maromio ecosystem. They were just living in the swamp. It was inaccessible to poachers, inaccessible to humans, and so they simply didn't move. We were under the impression that in the dry season, they came into the swamp, and in the rainy season, they left the swamp. That wasn't the case at all. The data that we've gathered over 5 years of having many individuals collared in that area has completely changed our elephant conservation plan and strategy. Counting animals, observing animals. This particular photo was taken in the Zambezi Delta ecosystem, which in 1995, when the current outfitter took over there was less than 20 zebras. Today, there's several thousand zebras. Protect them and they will come. But unless you've monitored the ecosystem and monitored the wildlife, it's going to be impossible to replicate that. And did it happen by mistake? Did it happen by chance? Or did it happen because it's what you planned for? And so whether it's a bison that one is collaring, in this case in the Henry Mountains, one of the last remaining wild populations of bison in America, whether it's tracking lions in the Zambezi Delta, science really, really matters, probably more today than at any other time. But it's also a time of our lives where we have more science at our fingertips. We've got incredible computers that can analyze amazing amounts of data. We've got an amazing advance in satellite technology and collaring technology, and all of these things that go into good science. And I think one of the things that all of us as wildlife enthusiasts very often fall prey to is our enthusiasm allows us to look beyond the facts and the science. But if we do the science first in order to generate the facts, our conservation will be infinitely more effective. So let's talk about traditional conservation for a minute. The anti-poaching, I'm not saying that community benefit overshadows anti-poaching. They have to work hand in hand. And there's thousands and thousands of rangers across Africa in a COVID year like this that are underfunded, but nevertheless, without those rangers, we don't have the protective aspect. But you've also got to have government buy-in so that the court sentences, etc., are also in line with what really makes sense. And so I'm biting off a huge chunk of stuff here, but these are the three components that have to be working together. Traditional translocations based on science and based on good data and facts. This can be an amazing tool for recovering an ecosystem or recovering a population. But if it's not well managed and it's not based on facts and the community don't benefit, it can also just be a huge waste of money, because wherever you put those elephants into, they might either just be killed straight away, they might leave the area because it's not suitable, and you end up with this giant pot of money that just got thrown into the wind. And so before any translocation, good science, the big three questions: did the species occur there originally? What eliminated it? And has that threat been mitigated? And thirdly, is the ecosystem ready for us to reintroduce the species? Those questions have to be answered from the perspective of science. This was in southeastern Oklahoma, where we went into some bear dens to gather data from the cubs, to see their genetics, to put microchips in them. And I have to say, going into a black bear den with a tranquilized, fully grown bear, it was an amazing experience for this not so scrawny anymore little African guide. And what you realize is that everything they do there with bears is based on data and facts. It's also based on community engagement, which we'll get into in a little while. But what I'm trying to illustrate with these photos is the length and breadth of this planet relies on those three legs of the conservation stool. The local community, whether they're in the middle of Oklahoma, whether they're in the middle of Mozambique, the local community has to play a role. Your decisions have to be done on good science, not hopes and dreams, and you have to have a bunch of traditional conservation. So let's ask the burning question, another elephant in the room, you might say. How is all of this paid for? Well, we can probably boil this down by starting off with this conversation. There's only 5 land uses. There's only 5 ways that we as humans use our land. We either settle it, which completely modifies it because it turns into places where we've got our homes and our cities and our towns. We can use it to feed ourselves, which is completely modified. I showed you the picture earlier of the tractor spraying the soybean field. We can mine it in order that I can have a computer and you guys can have a computer, and that we can, every single thing, if you look around your rooms right now, you look around where you are, every single thing that you require to live at one point was part of this planet. And many of them were extracted as minerals. So we can't point a finger at anybody. We can't say mining's bad because we all utilize it. You know, it always makes me laugh that the people that are anti-fossil fuel will actually jump on a plane and fly to a convention to do a presentation about it. Well, how did they get there? The whole plane was made out of fossil fuel and it's driven by fossil fuel. So we have to accept this real elephant in the room that we have impact. Then logging is another thing. I'm sitting right here at a wooden desk that at one point in its life was a tree. So we've got to accept that there's logging. And so really those top 4 absolutely dramatically modify their environments at the expense of biodiversity. There's only one that has the potential to maintain balance in an ecosystem if it's done responsibly, and that is tourism. And so tourism, there's 2 types of tourism. So people will say, man, we stayed at this absolutely beautiful lodge in Uganda. It was eco-friendly. There was, wonderful outdoor dining. The elephants came right up to the lodge. Let's look for a minute what that lodge is made out of. Those decks were also one-time trees. You know, the amount of sewage that a lodge like that generates, the amount of water that they utilize, the physical footprint of that lodge. There's no such thing as no impact. And whether you're at a giant lodge like this or a small intimate camp, there's still a footprint, there's still impact. But we have to look and agree that if it's responsibly done, the ecosystem here is still entirely better off than if we turn that into a city or a soybean field or a coal mine or a steel mill. And so really when you look at it, that's the photographic tourism angle. You've then got the hunting tourism angle. And I know that this is a hot button for many, many, many people, and people are very polarized over it. Let us just for a minute not talk about the hunter or the safari goer from a photographic perspective. Let's talk about the money that they generate and how that has got an opportunity of upholding an ecosystem. So we have to look at the business model, cold and hard, dealing just in facts, not emotion, and we come to a few realizations. And one of them has to be that hunting is a good conservation model when the revenue is used responsibly. So this year, Tanzania resettled several million acres of land. Why did that happen? So a few years ago, some of you will remember that Cecil the lion resulted in the ban of all import of lion trophies from Africa into the United States. Well, the United States was a stronghold of the lion hunting community. And what ended up happening is a lot of outfitters in Tanzania, where I might add, they have very, very stringent laws pertaining to the specific offtake of lions. A lot of those outfitters went broke and they handed their concessions back to government. Here we are a few years later, the local communities no longer get employed by the outfitters because they've gone. They no longer get the meat distribution from the outfitters because they've gone. And so the land sits empty, and local political pressure has pushed the government officials to turn that land into community settlement areas at enormous expense to the wildlife. But that's an uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to talk about. So instead of a quota of 2 lions on 500,000 acres, now they've all gone to make room for the cattle and the goats and the cornfields. And so did we really win anything by banning lion hunting? You may not like a lion hunter. You may say, well, that's an arrogant fat Texan that's going to come and hunt lions. Well, conservation sure does need their conservation dollars. And so unless we can find a viable alternative, we have to embrace that that is one of the land uses in which we have a hope that the ecosystem can be maintained. Now, oversubscribing from a hunting and overshooting perspective will destroy an ecosystem faster than anything. And certain types of hunting, such as canned lions, is the most despicable, disgusting practice you could ever come across. It's got no impact on conservation. It's purely it's purely to satisfy a very warped part of the market. And unfortunately, though, that overflows into the legitimate, responsible use of hunting as a conservation tool. But likewise, it's no different to going into the Timbavati and finding that there's, you know, many lodges and several thousand people spending their nights there, and millions of liters of water getting pumped to the surface and to the water hole in front of the lodge so people can watch wildlife. You find the elephants spending more time there than nature intended. The ecosystem's degraded. So again, you can be equally impactful and disrespectful of your ecosystem if photographic tourism is not done responsibly. So let's get on to another hot topic, which is effectiveness. How do you know if a conservation entity is effective? In my mind, there's only two things we should measure. Did the efforts of that entity result in more wildlife and a healthier ecosystem or not? I'm not interested in how many hairs there are on a hippo's tail, no matter how many millions of dollars you spend researching that. What I'm interested in is how can your research end up with more wildlife and a healthier ecosystem. So let's talk about one of our partners, a partner that we're very, very proud of at our own alliance, and that is the Giraffe Conservation Foundation, led by Julian Fennessy, who is a very blunt and very pragmatic conservationist. This is what they've achieved in the last 5 years. I'm actually sitting in their offices right now. It's an office that's got about 6 or 7 full-time employees. It's an office that one of our board donated to them, so they don't have any overhead for this office. And this tiny little team, through MOUs with African governments, through understanding the local community's needs and wants, have expanded wild giraffes home range by 5.2 million acres. Actually, that's just expanded again this year. So that's actually out. It's 6.2. They've moved 102 giraffe in 7 translocations. They've got 125 GPS units deployed in 9 countries. So they measure over 35,000 miles of data every year. 2,500 children per year are exposed to conservation just in Namibia, and that's excluding the other projects. And in Murchison Falls alone, they've removed over 1,000 snares just this year, 150 of which have come from live animals that have now given a second chance. So just that little report right there, this is not a 5-page document, but every line of it could be scientifically backed up if somebody needed. That tells me that they are effective, because the bottom line of all of that is more wildlife and healthier ecosystems. Now let's look at the Zambezi Delta ecosystem. A lot of people want to look past it because one of the main pursuits from a tourism perspective there is hunting. They hunt over 1,000 animals a year in that area. But in the last 5 years, with the introduction of lions, we've expanded the wild lions home range by 2 million acres. We've removed thousands and thousands of snares and traps. We've reduced the poaching within our area by 92%. We've got 2,500 community members that benefit from conservation. By benefit, what I mean is clinics and schools. And we have a plowing initiative. They used to all do slash and burn agriculture. We bought some tractors. We put them in areas that are already completely denuded. And now we plow for them and we provide fertilizer and seed. And so for every acre we plow, that saves an acre of forest that they're not slashing and burning. And so over the last 3 years, we've recovered about 500 hectares of land just by stopping them doing slash and burn. Then it goes further. By understanding the community wants and needs, we've offered them some incentives to move if they choose to. So we haven't told them they have to move. And we've moved about 50 families and got back about 10,000 hectares of land that used to have villages on and now are empty. And in return for moving, we plow for them, we distribute meat to them from the hunting operations. They've got a clinic and a school. Their lives are better and the wildlife is better off. Last year, we distributed 66 tons of meat to the different communities. So my next burning question So sorry, going back to that, that all sums up that absolutely they are effective. What we have done there absolutely has resulted in more wildlife and a healthier ecosystem. And so the research component on the ground has found things like the frogfoot moth and a species of butterfly that may never have been described again to science. We've just discovered a subspecies of chameleon that possibly has never been described to science. And so all of these exciting things could not happen if the Zambezi Delta was a rice paddy being used to feed people, which is what's happening on the northern banks of the Zambezi. So we have to prove that the wildlife is more valuable as a commodity than the rice. Because the moment the rice becomes more valuable, one way or another, politics will win, and this will just be another set of acreage that's under crops to feed the 8 billion people on Earth and not under wildlife. So the next burning question, the next hard question is, why does this matter? To me, it matters because of the future generation. It matters because of the shame that we will have if ever I have to talk to my grandchild and explain to them what a giraffe used to be, or if I had to take them to the zoo to see a zebra. And so the next generation, those are actually my kids in the picture, and they are some of the luckiest kids on the planet. They've seen giraffe translocations, they've held elephants' trunks as we're moving them, they've seen rhino darting and dehornings, they've seen the realities of poaching, they've seen the realities of collaring and good science. And I don't know if they're going to be interested in wildlife in their future, but what I do know is that they deserve to have the choice, and they won't have the choice if our generation doesn't do a good enough job of not only protecting the wildlife, but educating our youth to take the torch. And I'm not talking about youth like my kids. I'm talking about youth like the youth of the third world that are tomorrow's conservationists, and they are tomorrow's community. And so we truly do owe it to our future generations to ensure that there are healthy ecosystems with abundant wildlife. It's going to become harder and harder and harder. And what I always say to people as a concluding slide, people always say, well, that's all great, Ivan, but how do we help? And I always say that's also a three-legged stool. You can use social media not to make rash decisions based on one moment in time for a photo that has been carefully chosen to elicit a certain response, but use social media to your advantage to post good facts and science and dispel some of the myths that are the uncomfortable truths that hunting is bad or hunting should be stopped. You know, I have less impact because I eat vegetarian. We like to have windmills because there's no impact to generate our power. Those are all not really uncomfortable truths. Those are just simply lies. And we can use social media for the first time ever in history. Everybody's got a voice, and we should use that. We can use our dollars, but we can't just send our dollars into the black hole that's representative of so many of the ineffective NGOs that are just big marketing machines which use your money to generate a fundraiser, to raise more money like yours, to generate a fundraiser. And every now and again, there's a token amount that goes to the front line with which we do a little bit of conservation, and they use those very watered down wins. But most importantly, we can engage our youth. We can fascinate them, not with their screens, but by the colors on a grasshopper's wing or the beauty of a sunset, and not how many likes and shares they get on a particular post that they might have put onto social media for their virtual friends to see their virtual life. Folks, that's all I have. That's all I know. And I think if I get off my screen share, we've still got a little bit of time for some questions and answers and what's probably going to be a little bit of a lively conversation with any luck.
Hi, everybody. Ivan, thank you very much for that talk. I absolutely agree with you on many of the points, although some of them are quite complex, and there's a lot of issues that go into the various points that you made. But there's two other things that really concern me that very often people don't want to talk about. First of all is the growth of the population. Nobody wants to talk about things like, how do you manage that? You know, if you look at what China did, they made sure that, you know, all the Chinese citizens only had one child each, which has created a bit of a problem later on in life. So they've reversed that, and now they allow 2 children. So the population growth is a big issue for me, which I don't know what the answer is, but that has an enormous impact on the whole ecosystem, the environment, etc. And the second thing is corruption. And, you know, if you read many of the books about conservation, you learn a lot about the politics of conservation and all the corruption that goes into it. So for me, those are 2 major issues which have a major impact on the successes that we hope to achieve in conservation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tessa. Over to Ivan.
Yes, I agree with you absolutely and entirely, which is why I talk about the 8 billion people on Earth. And, you know, we've got this weird thing as humans to think that it doesn't apply to us. We don't want a Congolese to put a village in the rainforest, but we're quite fine with building a new estate on the edge of White River so that we can have an individual 1 hectare plot. So it doesn't apply to us. It only applies to everyone else. Most of the people on this chat have got children, and yet we are conservationists and we understand this population growth. But I think that I agree with you completely. I think that the humanitarian aid that flows into Africa absolutely will need to have a birth control component if we are to save Africa. There's no question. There's absolutely no question. But I also think that even as individuals, we need to be less wasteful of our resources, because as fast as the populations are growing, I'll take Mozambique as an example. We have 2,500 people in our community, and less than 200 of them are fully mature adults over 40 years old. That right there tells you our problem's not going to get more, it's going to get less. So, I mean, sorry, our problems are not going to get less, they're going to get more. And so I think that you're exactly right. But I also think that corruption is equally bad. And as conservationists, it's our duty to make sure that our mechanisms understand how to deploy the money effectively, because we operate in Congo, and I can assure you, corruption is under every single stone in Congo. We also operate in Mozambique, and corruption's under every stone there. But where there's a will, there's a way, and there's certain elements of community engagement and the way you engage community that can absolutely work, that you can exclude corruption. But I agree with you. Corruption and population growth are 2 massive things that nobody wants to talk about because we're all politically correct. One of my top donors has got 9 kids. What do you think would happen if I said, man, you're part of the problems here, you've got 9 kids? I mean, they're going to donate to somebody else. And so it's the elephant in the room is the fact that the very liberal outset where everybody is free to do what they want, that's actually not okay. At our school in Mozambique, we have a creche for the kids that belong to the 14-year-old girls that are at the school. And absolutely, we do include family planning, etc., but the government won't allow us to make that formal. The government wants there to be more people because children are wealth. And so we deal with that as well. And that's not really corruption. It's planned population growth by these African governments.
Thank you, Ivan. Just want to check if there are other hands. You can raise it electronically by going into participants, or you can just raise your hand and I'll see if I can pick it up. The technical team will help me with that. Apparently there's a question in chat. Let me just have a look there. I think there's a question by Sibyl Rietmiller. I'm told, not picking it up right now. If one of the team can just forward it to me on WhatsApp, I'll appreciate. Anybody else who would like to raise a hand?
Kyle Hind has raised a hand. Chris?
Okay, if you can unmute him. I'm just trying to pick him up.
Kyle, are you ready to ask a question?
Yes, yeah. I hope you guys can all hear me. Thanks. So I missed most of your talk, Ivan, but I caught the last end, which was pretty good. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I actually worked at Voluntourism camp, which I think you had a bit of a maybe for a while back. And I was just wondering, I don't know if you spoke about Zimbabwe, but I realized, like, I follow you on social media and you don't do that much work in Zimbabwe anymore. And I was wondering if, like, what your thoughts of wildlife in Zimbabwe going forward, and yeah, where you think if it's a positive outlook or if you're a little bit worried about it, things, yeah, just general comments.
Thanks, Kyle.
So absolutely great question. I appreciate the input there. So Zimbabwe is a very, very tough country to operate conservation in right now. It's a country where even the landowners, and I'm talking about conservation-minded landowners, are just not managing with COVID and all of that stuff. But if I tell you that, you know, Zimbabwe, of all of the countries we operate in, is one of the toughest, even just to get research permits to support research. We were just in there doing an assessment of Chiserera and an assessment of Sapi and an assessment of Mavuradona. And, you know, the fact that, you know, mining concessions are being given out in national parks, the fact that, you know, you're not allowed to say that a population has declined by poaching. Nobody would say that. We'd get into a place like Matusadona and we flew over the area. The population of elephant there is less than 300 elephant. When I was a youngster operating in Matusadona, there was over 3,000. And you say, is it poaching? No, it's not poaching. It's drought and it's other things. And so I think that the hope lies in the hands of you guys, the Zimbabweans that are right there. You're absolutely right. We did kind of start the Vundu Camp Lodge as you see it today, many years ago, and almost 20 years ago now. And you know what is very interesting is how the country has changed. And so what you've got to start with is driven and motivated individuals who are prepared to sit there and educate the locals. So the person in charge of Sapi right now, this minute, is a person who's had a management course at the Southern African Wildlife College. His name's Francis, I forget his other name, Francis Chidza, I think. Very good guy. He's an amazing guy. But he's in charge of Sapi, which is 300,000 hectares, and he's got a Land Cruiser and 4 game rangers. He has no support. Great Plains was supposed to go in there and give all of the anti-poaching, and they never did that. And so where is everybody holding the feet to the fire of the people making these conservation promises? And unfortunately, that's on the shoulders of your average Zimbabwean who is busy in survival mode and doesn't have the time to do that. And so, yeah, I don't want to sound, too doom and gloom, but I think it's got to start with the people in that country. They've got to want it badly enough to step up and do something. I think there's amazing hope at the moment with people like Park Recovery Fund, with African parks stepping into Matusadona and possibly Mana Pools. But I also think that the level of corruption is off the chart right now, and it's going to take government stability for that to come right. And on the shoulders of that, one can start doing some serious conservation, you know.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the insights.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Kyle. Checking, there's a question that came on chat, Ivan, from Sibyl Rietmiller. She just wanted to know if the hunting industry was also as badly affected in terms of the corona and the downturn of tourism, like in the rest of the industry.
I think the tourism industry, for the first time ever, has got one thing completely in common. You know, Kruger National Park has 1 million people a year, and for 3 months they didn't have a single person, not a single lodge, not a single camp, not a single day visitor had a single client. I've been doing a giraffe survey across South Africa. I visited 47 ranches during lockdown. We had a move permit to go and do biopsy samples, and there were guys that hadn't had a single tourist the whole year, single hunter the whole year. And so absolutely, it's incredibly badly affected. It's a year we can't get back. It's a year we can't afford to have no anti-poaching and so on. You know, we looked at the Zambezi Delta books with Zambezi Delta safaris, and you know, they have a pass-through of a huge amount of money. And a lot of that ends up supporting helicopters and anti-poaching and community development stuff. And we've just had to cut back on that because there simply isn't the money. So, you know, just an area like that, we've had 4 clients instead of about 130 from a hunting perspective. And those were guys that came in early season before lockdown. but there's no way for people to get here. And there's no way that they're going to risk coming here and having a 2-week quarantine on their way home. So I think the photographic and the hunting are in exactly the same boat. But I think the saddest thing that we saw in many of the privately owned ranches in South Africa that we visited doing the giraffe stuff was you saw people in KZN, you know, with a giant game ranch, and they've carved out 50 hectares for oranges. And you see people with game ranches around Nelspruit, with game farms around Nelspruit, and they've carved out 20 hectares for macadamias or whatever. So where's those 20 hectares come from? That's come from wildlife ecosystem. And so people are doing what it takes to survive. And very often in the tourism industry, it's at the expense of the wildlife, unfortunately.
Thanks, Ivan. It is a disaster for everybody in this industry at the moment.
Chris, we have Lorraine Chittock.
Thanks,
wants to ask a question.
Rod, thanks for coming in. Thanks for helping. If you can unmute her.
Lorraine Chittock.
Hello. I'm one of the people who came late, unfortunately. It kept bumping me off. But I'm going to be looking at the YouTube because it's a really exciting talk. And I loved how much you covered all the hypocrisy that happens. Really helped balance it out. I would like to know, in your hunting reserves or in your area, I know you addressed this a little bit, what people can do in other countries. But if, for example, someone came to your hunting concession area and wanted to help, what would you have them do? Or does that ever happen? Or do you allow it?
So you're talking from a volunteer perspective?
Yes. Well, I'm looking for ways that people can help, people who are not scientists or, you know, anything like that. Just the average person who loves wildlife. So
again, one of the things that Rod and I laugh about the other day, and Chris kind of pointed out, is I'm fairly blunt, and I get a lot of messages literally on a daily basis. Can we come and help? Can we come and help? Remember, we're in Africa where there's the cheapest labor on the planet. If we use volunteer labor, that's one less person from a community that can benefit. And then we've got liabilities. We've got to now have fairly expensive insurance because volunteers are all great until one of them stubs their toe. And then the other side of it, I don't mean to sound cynical, but the other side of it is a volunteer is not long-term. And so they'll arrive, they may or may not be good at what you want them to help with. You take time to train them, and as soon as they get proficient, they leave again. And so there's a big aspect of conservation that they call voluntourism, where volunteers pay actually fairly significant sums of money to come and volunteer. And there's an organization in South Africa that takes volunteers and they do citizen science with them, which is actually very, very worthwhile because these people they've got a vehicle that is supported by these volunteers, and the volunteers go out in the vehicle with a guide every day, and they go and they observe cheetah and monitor lions and do a lot of monitoring stuff that doesn't take a lot of skill, and they pay to participate in that, and their dollars uphold the conservation model within the area that they are participating. But that is very definitely voluntourism versus volunteerism. And so, whenever people say, how can we help? I say, help us spread awareness or get together a little group of people. I mean, I don't care if you sponsor a free running hound in the Kruger National Park that's catching poachers, and it takes 20 people to raise the annual salary of that. That really does work a lot better than flying over and helping, if you will. And it's not what people want. People want to come and get their hands dirty, and there are those opportunities where there's several sanctuaries, there's several areas. We don't take volunteers purely because of the liability, and we would spend more money on the insurances than we would on that we could get back from the volunteers, because people don't want to pay to volunteer. They just want to volunteer. That said, we do take on quite a few university volunteers, which are very often gap year students that have, got a 1 degree in biology and have taken a little bit of time off before they go to a different degree and stuff like that. and they are very, very useful with managing data, and because they already have a bit of scientific background, and they truly are useful to us when we arrive. But we're very, very careful about offering these positions to those people, because if they arrive and they've signed up for 6 months and they're no good, we've got them for 6 months, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Ivan. I just want to check, Lorraine, are you, you heard the answer? You okay?
I did, and I completely understand. I do work away at my cabin, and I have the same complaint. I get people coming and saying, oh yeah, I can help, I can stay there for free, but they don't know anything. The reason I'm asking the question is I'm doing a film that I'm hoping is going to raise funds for motorcycles for rangers in Uganda. But I also realize that not everyone is going to have money to be able to fund things, you know, especially in these times. So I'm looking for anything that I can like share with the audience, my audience, that they can do also. And yeah, and I know there's petitions that people can sign and social media posts, but I'm always looking for anything else.
All right, so, Lorraine, I think we'll have to have a talk one night, which is supposed to be a practical talk where people share ideas of how to do what to do.
I would love that.
You got to initiate it. Send me an email. I'll respond to you in a week's time. Putting you back on mute, Rod. Anything, Rod, you wanted to say about this? I know you also have some volunteers there. Putting you, Rod, if you can just unmute, and then after that, it is Shirley Engelbrecht's question.
Sorry, Chris, we do get volunteers here, but we don't take volunteers because we work with a specific requirement. We take volunteers who come for a 6-month period. So it's not voluntourism, it's volunteers, and they're people with proper qualifications with for our needs, which is animal husbandry. It's a vets or vet nurses or people to specific needs. It's a tough thing. Everybody wants to come and stay for free and for you to pay their holiday. So you've got to be careful of all the volunteer requests you get. And we get literally hundreds a year. So you have to, if we say we're looking for a volunteer to work in the pangolin project, we'll get 100 requests next week. And you've got to be very careful, like Ivan says. You know, these are yeah, you're stuck with people. And
okay, seems to be lost the line with Rod. Rod will probably come back in. Shirley Engelbrecht, I'm unmuting you. It seems like you had a question, please, Shirley. Except unmute. Yeah, you're on.
Hi, I'd just like to find out, how come conservation has never really ever been brought up in any schools anywhere in the world? They never talk about our animals or conservation or anything to do with our animals and trying to save our planet.
Thanks, Shirley. Over to Ivan. Ivan, I will also comment. Over to you.
Shirley, that's a very valid point, and it's actually something we've been working on. I have a person in the States that teaches about 40,000 teachers every school summer in the States. Now, in the state of Texas and everywhere else in the States, there's no mandatory conservation teaching at all. And I think it speaks to this great divide between technology and screens and whatever. The gap is getting bigger and bigger between humans and wildlife. In fact, I often drive along in town and I look around and I say, I wonder if there's anybody that I can see right now in this traffic jam that actually understands what a pangolin needs, or understands the value of a rhino horn, or really cares that, you know, the last northern white rhino slipped away. You know, we are more worried about the battery life of our iPhone than we are, you know, the northern white rhino is it's not a frog from the rainforest that nobody knows about. It's an animal the size of your dining room table. how can we be more worried about the battery life of our iPhones? With all of the technology in the world, we are way more excited about the new iPhone as a society than we are about the dwindling population of northern white rhinos. And I don't know the answer. Surely I wish it was different. But one of the things that we are absolutely working on is I've got my kids leading the lessons. They're 15-minute lessons, which include a 7-minute short film, followed by a Q&A of the most commonly asked questions. There's about 20 with each film and the correct answer for them. And a lot of them have got questions to do with, just understanding where your food comes from, understanding where, what the impact is of switching on a light. Just things like that we are generally very bad at as society. But you're absolutely right. Even in South Africa, there's a fair amount of conservation taught in my kids' school, but it's also a school with a huge amount of bush people as parents in that school. And so none of it's curricular, it's all volunteer, but there's nothing in the curriculum. You're absolutely right. And I don't know why that is.
Thanks, Ivan. Just from my side briefly, the LCA is together with the Sabina Platinum Africa Charities. One of the reasons why I'm in Germany at the moment, we are piloting in 5 African countries ways to enrich the school curricula with conservation-related content and actually create this understanding amongst the urban youth about the impact of our behavior on nature. We're not telling them they have to do it like this or that. We provide the information, like you said, about science, and then people can make a decision. We will probably pilot in 6 countries by the end of the meeting, the end of next week. It's been running for 2-3 years. Our patron, Sabina Plattner, simply said the only way we can really, really change the situation is through knowledge, and that's got to come through the curricula of schools. You cannot do it just informally and in a haphazard way anymore. So we're working on that big time, and we're also starting with new informative programs all over Africa. More about that later, but just say, totally in agreement. You cannot just think that it's going to happen through the few people who very often work in peripheral areas. 85% of the African youth are based in urban areas. And the only way you're going to connect them is through curricula that is activity-based. But that's just a comment. Okay, Riel Lewin, you have had your hand up for quite a while. Please unmute.
Thanks, Chris. Can you hear me?
Clear. Thank you, Riel.
Ivan, thanks very much for your talk. I think the most effective image for me was that lion paw with all the human hands around supporting it. I think that it speaks of the minimizing the human footprint on the planet. And I think what was nice about your talk was balancing just balancing people and wildlife issues, conservation, development, hunting, ecotourism. But the question interesting to see what your response is with regards to moving forward. I mean, people that we're talking about, you speak about biodiversity and biodiversity loss and how the impact that humans are having, our human footprint is really extensive, and then the question is how to minimize it, and I suppose education is the key. But from a policy point of view, would you have any ideas about, at the moment, from a conservation policy point of view, people are those CBD biodiversity targets? So this Convention for Biological Diversity was meant to protect biodiversity conservation, and it's an international convention, as you know, like CITES, and so CBD, and it's failed miserably. In the last, it was a 2020 targets. That was a meeting 10 years ago, and I'm sure a lot of the people in the audience know that the targets have failed. So now humanity is sitting in a position where there's rampant human population growth. The pressures are immense, and as you say, you don't want a doom gloom perspective, but from a positive point of view and from a win-win point of view, have you got any suggestions, Ivan, how we can turn it around with a focus on sustainable development and maybe moving away from biodiversity, like a preservation perspective? How do we address human population growth, sustainable development, poverty, education, there's these huge issues. But, I'm just trying to, what came up for me in your talk also was, custodianship and stewardship, and what Chris is saying about education, I agree, is key. You want to translate the importance of the nature and mainstream it into society. But, how does humanity move forward now, going forward? I mean, there's all these ambitious schemes, there's this campaign 2030, this Vice Foundation, there's even more ambitious plans about protected area. Sorry, I won't go on, but I'd like to just see what your response is with regards to how do you balance now conservation development realistically, and are there any pointers if from a, say, a policy point of view, I mean, for people who have got influence, in these decisions? Have you got any response?
Thanks,
So
Rael.
I'm going to answer with two examples, Rael. And one of them is Giraffe Conservation Foundation. They don't take a single step into a single country until they've got buy-in from the national government. So step one is to approach the Angola president and the highest minister of environment and tourism, or whatever it's called in these particular countries, and get their buy-in to allow us to build out a giraffe conservation action plan. Then they come in as partners, where it is their giraffe and their action plan that we then support. And then we go in, and within that action plan, we've asked them for certain laws to do with education, certain laws to do with translocations or habitat recovery, or monitoring and work permits for scientists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it can take many forms, given that we've got MOUs with everyone from Niger to Kenya, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Angola, whatever. And so that is the start point. And building a blueprint with your first one that you can now take to the second government and say, hey, this is what we signed with Angola. We now want to help you with your giraffe. And in Angola, we've done this, so therefore we want to do that with you. And if you really look at it, Rael, something that gives me amazing hope. And it's not just that he's a close friend of mine and we talk a lot, but is what, under the leadership of Peter Fernhead, African Parks is actually achieving. And so they also do not set one foot into a single ecosystem until they've got government buy-in into their MOU. And they go in there and they negotiate the terms of their MOU, and then they go in and they assess. And then after that, if the assessment comes out where they want it to be and where they think it should be, they will then engage and take over a park. And we can't argue that that is, at this point in time, the most violently successful group that there is. There's way more money flowing through some of the big, very commonly NGOs. There's way more money flowing through them, but they can't show you a single acre. There we go. They can't show you a single acre, and they can't show you a single species that has exploded like you can see in African parks or Qatada 11 or with any of the Giraffe Conservation Foundation landscapes that we operate in. And so I think that what the answer to your question is the fact that all of these giant meetings fail is for one major missing component. How many tribal chiefs and leaders are sitting at that table? It's all of the powers that be, whatever that means, and all the important conservation minds gathered around a table, very often without taking into consideration what's actually going to work at a government level and a policy level, and even on a smaller scale. So I'll give you a really good example. And this, the success of our lion move hinged on this one point. So we went to the local chief and we said to him, okay, we're going to bring these lions. And we spoke to every single community member. Our prelude to introducing the lions in Qatada 11 was about 2 years of research with a team of researchers. And the chief said, well, there's one problem. The spirit lions, and by the way, my brother is one, are going to kill the lions when they arrive. They're going to fight with them and kill them. So we dived into our history books and we realized that Livingston even spoke about that area and the spirit lions and this and that and the next thing. So we went back a few days later and we said to him, okay, so what must we do? He said, no, you must get all of the witch doctors from the area and we must have this big meeting and very predictably, you must bring a truckload of beer and a truckload of meat, and we will have a celebration and we'll ask what the spirits think. Well, we got the blessing of the spirits and we never had another hitch, but every year we have to get those guys together. Now, the scientific brain will poo-poo that, but at the expense of that entire project. And I think that that is a perfect example of taking into account the perspective of the local people in the area that you want to operate and building that into your action plan for conservation. So I think that's where African Parks does it differently. I think that's where GCF does it differently. And I really think that is one of the defining components of the plan, is these conservation communities that take into consideration local people and local governments just seem to be the ones that are successful.
Thanks, Ivan. Cheryl Ogilvie, and then after Esther Appleyard, please. Cheryl, I'm muting you.
Hi, Chris, thank you. And Ivan, thank you very much for that talk. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Education is crucial. And I personally think South Africa has lost the plot. It can be, all of this can be interlinked into every single learning area. It must be the whole school approach as well. And I think we need to rewrite the syllabus. We don't have to have the basics that's happening right now. We can link in everything, and we can link it into environmental education, and we can actually change perspectives. It should start, education should start at an early age, and that's been proven. And to get down to the crux where we starting to trying to educate adults, like the Izindunas, Sangomas, and so on, they already got their mindset. So it's very difficult to change those perspectives and change those attitudes and behavior. So we have to start at a younger age. And I wish South Africa can start implementing environmental education full-time into the school syllabus. And it mustn't just be indoors, it's got to be outdoors. And that's where our children get the most exposure. They've got to learn hands-on. So it's all to do with the 3 H's, heads, hands, and heart. And I firmly believe, thank you, Ivan, we have to start education. Thank you. It's just a point, sorry.
Thanks, Cheryl. Got that, thank you. Ivan, any comment?
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. I think that's a really, really well-received point. I think and again, apologies for the bluntness, but I think the 2 greatest threats to our wildlife is the exploding human population and the thought that someone else will save it. So when you say we, who's we? Is that you leading the charge, or is it you hoping that we, the community, someone's going to do it?
Cheryl, I know that you're trying to lead your charge, and so we all do, but it's very true, Ivan. Who's leading a charge, or are we hoping somebody else is going to do it?
And I think that what has to happen is, if we were to come together as a community and agree on something, which I know is something that scientists and conservationists could never do, but let's just dream for a minute and imagine we could agree. If we could agree that we need to petition and support the building of a curriculum that includes conservation, just in South Africa as one country. So you got one prime minister of one African country, I'm talking about Rwanda, that decided to outlaw rubbish. And in 2 years, Rwanda became a country that is so clean, you get a fine for throwing a cigarette stompy down, and you're not allowed to come into the country with a plastic packet. And so these things are possible. They absolutely are possible, but it takes a well-organized army and a very pragmatic approach to achieve them.
Thanks, Ivan. Esther Appleyard, please.
Thanks, Chris. Ivan, fantastic talk. Thank you. I actually studied environmental management, which is management of people's activities rather than the environment. But something that I wanted to bring up was, and maybe it's been dealt with, I know certainly in other African countries like Kenya, we have some of the best legislation in the world in terms of biodiversity, in terms of ecosystems. How do we get it managed and how do we get it implemented so that it actually means something? Because on paper, it actually means nothing. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that in terms of the rest of Africa and how it's done. Then another thing I wanted to bring up was just discuss, and I know, Rael, you mentioned the SDGs, but also in that and in our biodiversity legislation, there is also alien vegetation. And have you had any dealings with that up in Africa as well, in terms of part of wilderness and ecosystems is also managing that alien vegetation? And how have we dealt with that, if you have? Thanks.
Thanks, Esther. Ivan?
Yeah, Esther, those are some massive topics there. I haven't had any direct dealings on invasive species from a plant perspective. What I will tell you is one of the hardest things that I've ever seen or attempted is to bring conservation awareness to. So our sanctuary at Luwero Primates is on the edge of Kahuzi-Biega National Park. And as you drive there, you drive through a couple of hours of community where literally if a whole village sees $10 US a month passing through, you've got guys on the side of the road with a hammer breaking rocks to make gravel for $1 a day. And so now going and talking to those people about biodiversity and invasive species and policy and whatever, it's deaf ears, because there's a great quote. I didn't know how long I would have, but I wish I'd included the slide. Appreciating the beauty of wildlife is a concept that can only be understood by someone with a full belly. And I really firmly believe that. And all of us, when times get really, really tight, all we think about is our most primal needs, which is food and shelter and somewhere safe. And we'll drop everything to protect our kids. We'll drop everything to put food in our belly. And I think that taking into consideration the communities that one is dealing with, we have to be able to prove to them how their life is better with biodiversity, how their bellies are fuller with biodiversity, how their wallets benefit from biodiversity. If we aren't able to achieve that, then we can't manage. And that's why I say that the hunting component, which turns a lot of people off, the meat generated from that it's a currency. It absolutely is a conservation currency, is this meat that's generated. The money that's generated by it is absolutely something that, when well used, can support a conservation initiative. And one of the things that, it's slightly diverse of your question, but one of the things that I think really gets under my skin when we talk about policy and these things, because there's nothing sexy about moving an invasive plant. There's everything sexy about collaring an elephant. So everybody wants to do the elephant collaring and support it and finance it. No one wants to finance the removing of lantana from KwaZulu-Natal. So really, when you look at it, you'll get these giant NGOs or bodies of people that have got enormous wealth, but by virtue of the fact that they're wealthy, they'll say, look, we'll give you this money, but you are not allowed to ever engage in hunting on this property, or you are not allowed to allow your rangers, we'll support your rangers, but they can't be armed or whatever. So now suddenly you've got these massive conservation groups that are getting dictated to by wealthy people in the first world who don't understand the problem, but by our hunger for their money, we end up bending to their wants and needs. And that's a very, very destructive cycle as well.
Thanks, Ivan. Ivan, I think Lorraine Chittock left. There was in the chat, there was just a comment that she should check out what the South African honorary rangers are doing voluntary, but we'll stay in touch with her. Also, there was a question in chat about the success you had. Eva, I think, asked a question. She was curious to know about the film and the value, and does it generate income? I don't know if I saw that you tried to answer in chat. Want to say something about that, Ivan? You're on mute, Ivan, please.
Sorry, the mute and the unmute gets me. I'm not very smart. So absolutely Carter's War, where what we did, for those of you who've seen an episode, is we go into an area, I pose as a wildlife investigator, we go and we identify a problem. We look at it from the perspective of the wildlife, the perspective of the community, and the perspective of a solution or a conservationist. And then we go down this trail of discovery of what works and doesn't work. And it's very well shot. They're 1 hour long episodes, and they're very, very compelling. They generated actually so much money that we started the foundation on the back of that. And the reason we started our own foundation, and this is going to be interesting, is I started sending the money through third-party groups, but it got to be quite a lot of money. And all of a sudden, they wanted to divert it to stuff that they thought was important, not necessarily stuff that we thought was important. And then they wanted to start earning commissions from it, and this and that and the next thing. So I thought, well, as much as the world does absolutely not need another not-for-profit, let's start one, but it has to be based around tangible returns on our conservation investment. So I put together a board of people who are all business people. Not one of them is a volunteer. They volunteer their time, but they are all business people with a role to play in the development. And as you know, to build a sustainable business in the current economic, the last 20 years, that takes a determined individual. So we pride ourselves in running it as a business. We don't have anybody that's on our staff that is not paid the normal amount that they would get in the non-conservation world. And we are 100% all about results, tangible results. So expanding ecosystems, doing aerial counts so that we can measure our impacts. And so a good tangible result is one of the things we did was bring the free running hounds from Texas and put them in Kruger National Park. Well, when we put those hounds in place, they were losing a rhino every 8 hours. Now, they are not the only component that has led to the drop, but today they're losing a rhino every 2 weeks. And we've caught well close to 200 people in the park and confiscated almost 100 firearms. And it's had this massive impact. And so if I showed you the return on that investment of $250,000 to bring those hounds into the country, and then the $200,000 it takes to maintain the kennels every year, we've got a massive, massive impact from that. And it's measurable, and you can back up what the measurements say. The lion research, we were just talking about parrots earlier. Our sanctuary in Congo takes parrots from the illegal trade, and we recover them and then release them back into the forest. So there are these tangible results, but absolutely all of the money that goes to that, and we're a small organization, we deploy about $2 million a year, but all of that comes as a result of people's response to media that we generate. And so not wanting that to stop, that's why we started the Conservation Film Company, which is based in Cape Town, where we don't film wildlife and we don't film people, we film conservation. So we build short films around real conservation that's actually happening and real wildlife problems that are actually on people's radar and getting solved with a view to building recognition. So right now what I'm doing in Namibia is we're getting a bunch of interview pieces for Giraffe Conservation Foundation, and we're doing a 1 hour long documentary all about how they, through engaging communities, have been so successful. And that's going to CGTN, China Global Television Network. It'll air through 800 million homes in 110 countries. And it's got all the right messaging around it. And what you realize is that step one, what you produce has to be entertainment first, otherwise nobody will watch it. There's got to be high stakes, so it's got to be exciting. And then you can build in the education component into that. If you don't set out to entertain them first, you're just another talking head, and no matter how passionate you are, after a minute or two, people are done and they check out. So yeah, it's certainly the films feed the foundation, which feed the initiatives, which feed the film. So it's a great little ecosystem.
Thanks, Ivan. Just want to say that Brian Joubert raised his hand, but before we unmute him, just two things. Ifa Spiritus gave you a round of applause. And just from my side, I just want to say it is such a pleasure to listen to you talking and all the multifaceted things that you address. Like I said, we can agree or disagree on many things, but you've looked at the full circle. Thank you, Ivan. I really appreciate your talk and the way that you address things. Brian Joubert, if you would just like to unmute. I guess we're getting to the end of our I'll talk slowly. Brian, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ivan. That was a really good talk. I'm a born and bred South African conservationist, but now applying my trade in Canada. But, you know, I think about this conservation funding question a lot, both in an African context and here. And we've certainly learned a lot from COVID about how fickle that can be and how risk averse foreign visitors can be. If you were to think of an innovative funding mechanism or a suite of funding mechanisms into the future, and you know, we're seeing hunter populations, at least for, you know, hunters that would visit Africa, graying out. You're aware of the various R3 initiatives in the US where they're desperate to recruit new hunters. I'm sitting in one of the jurisdictions in North America that's, I think, the only one bucking that trend with increasing hunter numbers. So the people visiting Africa, the hunters visiting Africa, may start winking out slowly. I mean, the demand's probably still there now. Lots of outfitters booked out many years in advance, but when that well starts to run dry, when you cross a threshold where you simply can't get enough people to fund those areas, what are people starting to think of as alternatives? Foreign largesse, lottery funds, etc., etc.
So, Brian, that's a really interesting question. And I'm going to answer it by just telling you two of the things that we have in place that we are working really hard on. And absolutely everything we do, we are the polar opposite of most organizations like us, because we want to share it and we want everybody to do the same. There's this weird mentality around NGOs where they think that there's only a certain amount of money. And if Carter gets $1 million, that's $1 million we couldn't get. Well, I'm here to tell you there's as much money as you can convince people to give you, and it's not that way. But as we stand today, I've got in year 3 of their growth, surrounding the Kahuzi-Biega National Park, 350,000 coffee trees. And by virtue of 350,000 coffee trees, all owned by the community and all which will be processed through a washing station owned by the community, we can generate enough money to not only look after Kahuzi-Biega, but the next 3 parks along. And I really believe that with the awareness that people have for conservation today, you will probably be able to charge a premium for conservation coffee. And so if we can generate 150 tons of coffee a year on the edge of the national park, which is a very small fraction of what should be able to be generated from those trees, your traditional agricultural model will absolutely save that area. Now, I want to just touch on something here, just because it's humorous and it's an uncomfortable truth, but probably everybody in this room has heard all the griping and whining about palm oil, and how the palm oil is destroying the orangutan habitat and all this other stuff. Let's not forget that every single bean of coffee grown in the world today is grown where there used to be a rainforest. But that's uncomfortable because we all love coffee, and so nobody has demonized it. But we demonize palm oil because we believe we can do without it. And so if we can take that coffee and turn that around and allow the coffee to not only support the community to the degree that they can buy food instead of bushmeat, and support the anti-poaching to the degree that we don't have to have funding, it all works. We've just put in our 600th beehive in Mozambique. And again, we've got some bee experts and scientists monitoring it. We believe that with 2,500 hives in Mozambique, we're going to be able to pay for our anti-poaching in that area with or without tourists. Now, all of these things, one builds a blueprint around, because there's massive areas of rainforest parks in Africa that could absolutely, there's more people, as we've been talking about, so there's more people drinking coffee. And if around every rainforest park there was a halo of coffee, the world would be a wonderful place, because the coffee would be paying for the conservation. And I think pragmatically, that's what we've got to look to. We cannot just rely, tourism is very nice, but we should look at it as a bonus, not a necessity. So if some tourist dollars are generated, that's great. Grab it with both hands. But we need to be able to stand on our own 2 business feet in a way that our ecosystems can be supported in some way, shape, or form in the way that we're discussing. And so it's no different to, you know, if you're in the States, you know about Texas and oil drilling and horizontal drilling and all of that stuff. You don't have to destroy an ecosystem to drill oil. And so the oil in Murchison Falls National Park, the way that they plan to extract it with their Chinese partners, and the way they've put the highway through the park and the Bodongo Forest, absolutely has destroyed that ecosystem. If it was looked at more pragmatically and more carefully, and they didn't have the Chinese in there, and the Ugandans mined that oil themselves from outside the park with horizontal drilling, the oil could have been the best way to fund that park and fund the Ugandan economy of anything that we could have ever found. So I don't want to be too quick to say oil is bad or minerals are bad or agriculture is bad. If it's used well, and Brian, if we are careful and pragmatic about the way we plan these things, the best thing you could possibly have would be an open pit diamond mine on the edge of a giant biosphere reserve, you know?
Thanks, Owen. I guess the last question I'm going to take is from our friend Marty Jasper. Marty is a wonderful supporter and honorary ranger. Always raise interesting questions. Marty, your turn. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk, Ivan. Just trying to understand, I mean, I think one of the biggest things, and you've touched on it in many different ways at different times, is biodiversity that's being destroyed and habitat destruction and pressure on that. So in a country like South Africa, how do you actually reverse that and extend our parks larger? I mean, I think is there actually a practical way to do that? Because I mean, in other parts of Africa, sure, some parks can get larger and areas can get turned back to national parks, etc. And there's a lot of hunting farms that were agriculture have been turned to hunting in South Africa, etc. But actually, how do you extend your national parks in this country?
Thanks, Marty. Ivan.
Marty, that's a giant question. So one of the facts, again, an uncomfortable fact, is less than 10% of the gazetted parks in Africa are actually fully functioning. Less than 10%. I think there's 300 and something parks across Africa. And technically speaking, Marty, the wildlife footprint in South Africa is growing faster than any other country in the world. So specific examples are fences being taken down between private land areas in the greater Kruger and the Kruger proper. These big conservancies taking down their internal fences and providing private parks or reserves. And when you look at every single one of those, it's all with financial gain in mind. So the model truly does work. I think that, you know, it's a very difficult thing. You remember, if you put your African government hat on, they are balancing between needing the votes of the masses and trying to keep everybody else happy. So unfortunately, the human vote usually wins in the end, but we as conservationists have to convince the local communities that the wildlife will provide for them very much better than they could do any other how. And I think that's a lot easier in areas like Kruger. It's very, very difficult in areas of good agricultural, you know, conditions, because, you know, agriculture makes a huge amount of money and it's very hard to get wildlife to come close to agriculture. And another good and very real example is somebody that I know that is north of Hoedspruit. They had a small wildlife concession. It was about 15,000 hectares, and they hunted on it. It was open to the Kruger, and they got so much hate mail and all of that stuff, they eventually decided to pack it in. And today they grow oranges. So none of the wildlife won, but they don't get hate mail anymore. They make a lot more money, and everybody on their side is happy. The only thing that lost in that scenario is the wildlife. And yet that's an uncomfortable truth, because we all like orange juice, and the anti-hunter sitting in Europe drinking their glass of orange juice doesn't realize that was grown on land that was once wildlife land, and their voice was probably a part of turning that to oranges. So again, not to be doom and gloom, and these conversations always end up with, you know, a lot of hard facts and whatever, but the reality is expanding national parks is a big deal. But in countries like South Africa, where land ownership is a very real thing and wildlife ownership is a very real thing, I think you'd find that the wildlife footprint in South Africa is expanding massively. And, you know, I think it was 30 years ago when they did the first kind of estimation, and they thought there were 750,000 animals known in private hands. And today it's over 20 million. I'm not sure where that actual paper is, but I know that there was a research paper that was generated about 3 years ago. And in those days, they talked about 18 million animals. But if you look at their curves and you carry on their graphs a bit, with the continually expanding footprint into wildlife and privately owned wildlife, we're seeing more growth in that sector than any other land use in South Africa.